Good morning, folks. So I am Eric Bruns. I am a professor in the University of Washington School of Medicine and Associate Director of the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. And we would love to welcome everyone to the University of Washington Smart Center's 2022 Virtual Speaker Series. Today, I have been assigned and am privileged to be able to introduce the second of this year's 4-installment Smart Speaker Series. Last month, we had an amazing talk from our friend and colleague, Dr. Kimberly Arnold, on advancing mental health equity in schools. We have 2 more talks, as you can see on the schedule here, in April and in May, from Drs. Tish Jennings and then Drs. Ternette Powell and Walter Gillian, who will be doing a joint presentation. And you can watch recordings from any of our speakers from the 2020, 2021, and 2022 series on our website. And real quick, want to make sure that we acknowledge our funders and sponsors. This is made possible by grants from the U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, as well as our school mental health supplement of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. As we do with every event or gathering at the Smart Center, we wish to acknowledge that members of the University of Washington Smart Center and Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center learn, live, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We aim to live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. And we encourage you to learn about the ancestral lands that you are joining us from as well. Okay, great. So a little bit about the Smart Center, and then we'll get started. Our mission here at the Smart Center is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students. And we do this through a 3-legged stool of research, training and technical assistance, and support to policy making. Here's just a little snapshot of folks at the Smart Center from a holiday party that we had in December on Zoom, of course. We see the Smart Center as residing at the intersection of the 3 aims of conducting basic research on school mental health, generating evidence on what works in school mental health, and then mobilizing that evidence. Because we know that merely providing access to services, which schools as the most common venue for mental health services for young people, does not necessarily mean that the services are necessarily of high quality. So we're trying to make sure that we are both promoting access as well as quality and outcomes. So we see the Smart Center achieving that aim by residing at that intersection of those 3 aims: basic research, generating evidence on what works in school mental health across the tiers of effort in schools, from universal school-wide all the way up to intensive interventions, and then mobilizing the evidence that we generate, both by providing research-based training and consultation and technical assistance, as well as informing policy and funding strategies at local, state, and national levels. So that's a little bit about the Smart Center and what we do. A couple last things about the Smart Center. We have these amazing postdoctoral research fellows, and the series is funded by a postdoctoral research training grant from the Institute of Education Sciences. And as such, we would be remiss if we didn't introduce our postdoctoral fellows, including Kathy Corbin, Maria Hugh, Courtney Zuloff McCurdy, and Alana McVeigh, who will be facilitating the Q&A for us with Dr. Boyd. They have been instrumental in developing this series, which has just been fantastic. And then the last note, the series is also sponsored by the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which is, as this map indicates, one of 10 SAMHSA-funded regional centers focused on improving the mental health workforce across all settings. Last bits of information: as part of the national MHTTC network, our Northwest School Mental Health Center supports the mental health workforce in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, Region 10 of the SAMHSA map, so to speak. And we invite you to reach out to us by connecting through email, social media, signing up for our listserv, which is how many of you might have learned about our speaker series in the first place, or regularly visiting our website. And so you'll see some links, I'm sure, in the chat right now about how to get informed through the MHTTC. We need to put the disclaimer out there that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration sponsors this work, but it doesn't necessarily reflect any official position on this content. Okay, at long last. So that was like, in jazz terms, that was vamping, right? As people get into the room, get settled in, get their coffee. I'm very pleased to present Dr. Brian Boyd. So Dr. Boyd is a professor and director of the Juniper Gardens Children's Project at the University of Kansas, and as director of a community-based applied research center focused on child development. Dr. Boyd has been heavily engaged in research that involves the most vulnerable and often marginalized populations. A special educator by training, Dr. Boyd's research has involved the development and evaluation of evidence-based practices to be implemented within school-based contexts. And as such, he's a true, aligns so well with the SMART Center and its mission as well. So this work has led to some of the first comparative efficacy studies of classroom interventions for preschool-aged children on the autism spectrum. His more recent work has focused on issues of implicit bias and how issues of implicit bias and race affect the lives and outcomes of families and autistic individuals of color, and strategies to address racial and ethnic disparities. Dr. Boyd's work has been continuously funded by both the Institute of Education Sciences and the National Institutes of Health, and currently he serves on multiple national boards that are dedicated to improving the outcomes of individuals with disabilities and those from historically underserved communities. And so with that, I will hand it to Dr. Brian Boyd. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm one of those who tends to over-prepare a little bit, so I probably have more slides than time allotted, so I may skip through some things just to make sure that we have enough time to engage in Zoom-based conversation around these important issues. So I'll tell you, my early work in autism really didn't focus on issues of race or implicit bias. I came to this work a little bit later in my career, and it was really an interaction with a Black father of a young autistic child that led me in this direction. I was facilitating a group around behavior management strategies. It was a parent support group that was part of a research project. And there were about 5 parents in the group. Most were white women with young children with autism, but one was a Black father. And he was telling me a story that I had heard before, really that his son, who I believe was about 3 or 4 years old at the time, that anytime his son would go into a store that he would tantrum because he, to some degree associated stores with getting access to new toys. And one strategy, that sometimes is recommended is to provide the child an access to something that he can have to take in the store with him, right? That he only gets access to this preferred thing when he goes to a store. So he doesn't have to associate. So he associates the store with getting access to a preferred toy he already has instead of having to buy or get a new toy. And the dad just stopped and he looked at me when I recommended this and he said, I can't do that because they'll think I stole something. And I thought, I know exactly what you mean because I'm a Black man. I've been followed around in stores before. And I understand the experience you're sharing with me. And I also know he felt comfortable sharing that experience because I was also Black. And he knew that I likely had those common experiences. And I thought about what if someone else had recommended that strategy and he hadn't followed through? Would the clinician, therapist who recommended it thought, it was non-compliance in some way versus understanding the larger systemic forces that made him make that decision to not follow through on that particular therapeutic strategy. So those interactions with families have led me to some of this work, but I think it's a helpful starting context for what I'm going to talk about today. So what I want to do is really just spend a little bit of time providing an overview of what we know about implicit racial bias and how that differs from what we call structural or institutionalized racism. So just to provide some context for the discussion. And then I'm going to share some preliminary data with you from at least one study and maybe a second one if we have time. But the point of the data are to guide the discussion. It's not a data-based or data-heavy presentation. It's really to help us understand how these issues of bias and structural racism are perhaps impacting actual outcomes of my racial minority children with autism. And then, as I said, hope we can have a conversation around many of these issues today. So one of the things that we're beginning to see in the field of autism, and what I say are some of the more replicated findings in the field, are these patterns of disparity. And they manifest in multiple ways. So we are seeing some closing of the gap in terms of actual prevalence of autism among Black and white children. But we still see that Black children are more likely to have a delayed diagnosis or misdiagnosis early on. And that Latino children are still seen to be underidentified. We also tend to see disparities in access to services for racial minority or poor children with autism. So getting access to fewer lower quality services. Those families are more likely to live in service deserts, so having to travel further to get access to high quality services, being less likely to have a coordinated care medical home. We're also beginning to see some disparities in what their lives are like post high school, when there's no longer the structure and safety of the supports provided through the school system in place. And we're beginning to see some phenotypic differences, if I can say that word today. There's been some research that Latino children, for some reason, have a more severe symptom presentation. Black children are twice as likely as white children to have a co-occurring intellectual disability, in addition to having autism. There's been some more recent research on Black male autistic adults showing that they're more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia and also being more likely to have a high blood pressure, right, and cardiovascular disease. High blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, right, being conditions that we know affect Black people in general. So we're beginning to think about we're beginning to see lots of these disparities play themselves out along racial ethnic lines. And then the question becomes why, right? And that's the harder question, the more complex question we have to answer is why are these disparities there? And that's where we're going to begin to talk about today. And are issues of implicit bias and structural racism impacting and driving some of these disparities? So these are pre-pandemic data. I haven't looked at the latest poverty data since the pandemic unfolded, but one of the things we know within the context of America is that there is this intersection of race and class, right? Around 60% of American Indian, Black, and Latinx children live in low-income households compared to about 30% of white and Asian children. And the reason this is important is because we talk about this sort of intersection of race and class being associated with what is called concentrated or compounded disadvantage. Being low income or living in a low income area means you're also more likely, because of the way school systems are often funded in those states and counties, to live in a school system that, for your child to attend a school system that's lower resource. You're also more likely to live in a racially segregated neighborhood that is usually higher in poverty. And so then that affects access to services and supports. And so poverty, and because minorities are more likely to live in poverty, compounds disadvantage. And the way we talk about or think about inequity is really along three lines. First, there's an equity in access, so your ability to access needed services and support. Then there's an equity in experience. So even for families who can access needed services, the quality of those services are often inferior to what you find for higher income families or more privileged families to some degree. And the third line is an equity in outcomes. So because you're getting access to inferior services, your outcomes may be different. So it's important to think about inequities along different lines and how is this really playing itself out and what does it mean for outcomes for racial minority children with autism. And so we know a popular word that's been used a lot is that of intersectionality, which was coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And we're talking about the intersection of multiple minoritizing identities, really multiple minoritizing identities that can exacerbate disadvantage because of systemic oppression. Right? And so what we know is that people can't separate their identity. You can't separate being autistic from also being Black or being autistic from also identifying as being LGBTQ. In talking to my colleague of mine, Paul Shattuck, who did a lot of work within the context of Philadelphia, which is a high population of Blacks, he did a lot of work with families, and when he went out and talked to families of Black autistic children about their needs, about what would be helpful for them, he thought they'd talk about, things related to autism, their kids, having, learning or gaining social skills or making friends. But what those Black families wanted to talk about was their kids not being shot by the police, because they couldn't separate, right? And their kids can't separate having autism or perhaps engaging in odd mannerisms or mannerisms that are viewed as odd by society, or not being able to communicate as well because of their autism from being Black and the impact of policing in that community, in that city. And so families can't divorce these things, and we need to stop asking families to divorce these things, but rather understand the impact of being multiple minorities on outcomes and how it affects their experiences and their quality of life. So I'm hoping this video can play, but it's from a Black mother of an autistic adolescent, and I think it again helps set the context for this presentation.
I could start with, what does it mean to be a Black mother, period? So for us as parents, there is always an anxiety. I like to say that the feelings, the memory, and the spirit of historical trauma and the story of Emmett Till just lies within our womb, within our soul in the Black community. The fear of a Black mother. I mean, I always say Black folks are not allowed to be unapologetically themselves. They are not permitted to be neurodiverse. And we know this on a lot of levels. So my biggest fear is if an officer approaches my child and my child begins to stem, have to put his hands in his pocket to take out one of the little things he likes to hold on to help him with his anxiety. He's got one of his little trinkets or things that he holds on to and reaches into that pocket to pull it out to calm himself. What's going to happen to my son?
And I think that is the question we're trying to answer, right? What is going to happen to our son? Being Black and autistic, what does that mean for him, right? And so that's the kind of work I'm really interested in. And so the issue with being racial minority and having autism is that we have to understand the role of these larger societal forces on outcomes. So systemic factors of racism, wealth inequality, residential segregation, and also implicit racial bias and how that's relating to some of the outcomes and disparities that are pointed to that we're seeing. So I want to define some terms before we keep going here, just so that we're all on the same page. So institutionalized or structural racism, really the definition of that is thinking about the structures, policies, practices, and norms in our society, resulting in differential access to goods, services, and opportunities because of race or by race. And this definition is by Kamara Jones, who's the former president of the American Public Health Association. And racism is structural, right? Because it is often legalized and reflected in our policies and laws. And that's different from implicit bias, which is really sort of unconscious, involuntary associations that are really how our brains do. They associate social groups with essentially stereotypes, right? And all of us have implicit biases. Everyone has them. They're actually normal. They're almost a way that our brains process or categorizes information. They really help us with information processing. And they're not about explicit prejudice or explicit racism. As a matter of fact, we have implicit biases even when we try to actively reject being overtly racist or engaging in prejudicial attitudes and beliefs. So very different from actual structural racism. These are unconscious processes. I'm not going to ask about this, but for a lot of folks, these images may immediately conjure up thoughts. Now, most of us try to then suppress what our initial thoughts are, but this is the question. But we know that images and seeing people conjured sort of sometimes stereotypic thoughts and beliefs. And what we do with those, how we act on those, is what can be associated with outcomes. And just to be clear, implicit bias, again, is not a euphemism for racism. It's very different from overt racism. And what we also know is that unlike explicit racism or overt racism, which is associated with education level, implicit bias is not. We see similar levels of implicit bias amongst teachers, doctors, and lawyers as we do among the general population. What we also know, though, is implicit bias is associated with actual behavioral output or performance. So it's been associated with less friendly interactions with Black conversational partners, less positive interactions between white doctors and minority patients, more biased sentencing among jurors and judges, and discriminatory practices within job hiring. One of the more interesting things that's been found, though, is that if we actually aggregate implicit bias at the larger city, county, or even country levels, that's actually a better predictor of behavior than if we just look at the level of the individual. So what does it mean to live in a county or an area where there's high levels of implicit bias? So let me give you a couple of quick examples before I turn to the data for today's presentation. So I know this may be a little hard to see, but what you're seeing at the top here is that in different countries, there are 8th grade science tests that are taken. And what you're seeing on the x-axis here is an implicit association test that you can take online, where we're looking at the association between are males better at science or women better at science. And so what this was showing was a bias for males being better at science and women being better at liberal arts. But what they found was in countries where there was this male bias, where there's a bias for people to think males are better at science, that you saw males actually do better on those 8th grade tests, right? So this is at the data aggregated at the country level. Looking at state level data in the US, for tests where they were doing implicit association tests, online tests, between are Blacks more likely to have weapons? Do you associate Blacks unconsciously, implicitly with weapons versus whites? In states where there were higher associations, implicit associations, unconscious associations between Blacks and weapons, we saw more disparate use of policing, of police force with Blacks in those states. So letting us know that there's this association between aggregated and implicit bias data and actual behavior, how it impacts us in society. And again, when we aggregate implicit bias data at the state or county level, what we also find in the US is that in places with higher amounts of implicit racial bias, we also tend to see larger health disparities in cardiovascular disease, larger racial disparities in infant health, larger racial disparities in upward mobility for Blacks, more Google searches for racial slurs, and more segregation, both in terms of housing and school. So this is having a societal impact. And one last study I want to point out, what you're looking at on this slide is a map of the first count in 1860 of the enslaved population. And 1860 was the first year that they began to count slaves as part of the US Census. So this is really obviously the southern states here, Virginia, where I grew up, and North Carolina, where I moved from before I came to the Midwest. And so this, in the darker areas, the darker shading means more slaves in those particular counties in those states. And a good friend of mine, Keith Payne at the University of North Carolina, published a paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago, looking at the relationship between the number of slaves in 1860 and current levels of implicit bias in those same states. And so the top map there is, again, the number of slaves in those states. And the bottom map there is current levels of implicit bias. And you can even see already that you tend to see, so darker colors being more implicit bias, just like darker colors are more slaves in those states. So there's already an association between where we see implicit bias and where there are more slaves in a particular state. And again, remember, this was the number of slaves in 1860 with modern day levels of implicit bias in those same places. And what they found was, if you aggregate the data at the county level, that there was indeed a relationship between the number of slaves in 1860 and more pro-white bias in those counties. If you aggregate the data at the state level, there's even a stronger association between those two constructs, between the number of slaves and pro-white bias in those states. Okay. So what about implicit bias in autism? This has been looked at in another study by Obed and some colleagues. And what they had college students, Black and white college students, read vignettes describing an autistic child or a child with conduct disorder. And these vignettes are randomly paired with a photo of a Black child or a white child. And what they found was within group racial bias. So white college students were more likely to associate autism with white children and conduct disorder with Black children. And Black college students did the opposite. So they associated autism with Black children and conduct disorder with white children. But why this matters is that a lot of our clinicians and diagnosticians are white. And so if they're implicitly associating white children with autism, what does that mean for the diagnosis of racial minority children, right? So this is how these things play themselves out in real life in society. So the data for today is related to implicit bias and looking at some of these constructs within Kansas. Yes, not the most geographically diverse state, but we do have some racial ethnic diversity here. We're going to talk through some of the things we found. But again, the data are really just to set the stage for a larger discussion. So what we're looking at is, one, do Black or Latino children with autism differ from white children in their access to school and mental health services? But more importantly, are these county level measures of implicit bias? And we also had some county level measures of structural racism. So Black poverty, Black upward mobility, and residential segregation. Because one of the things that Keith Payne found in an article associating slaves in the 1860s with modern day levels of implicit racial bias was that what mattered was concentrated poverty amongst Black residents, not just poverty in general, but how much of that poverty was actually concentrated amongst Black people. So we looked at Black poverty rates and how that was associated with differences in access to services. And so what you're seeing here is data from the implicit association test. So the implicit association test is really maintained by Project Implicit at Harvard, and anyone can go online for free and take it. And what you're seeing here is in the data from the Kansas City metro area, so representing sort of Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri. Don't ask me for the dividing line because I'm still new to the area. But darker shading here is more implicit bias in those counties. And you're seeing a lot of gray there. What that means is not that implicit bias doesn't exist. It means that not enough people in those counties have gone online to complete the implicit association test, so we can't pull data from those counties. Okay. And this is data from the US Census, looking at Black poverty rates in those same counties. Again, darker areas means more poverty amongst Black residents in those counties. And gray means we couldn't pull data. This is from a database we have some access to, looking at the amount of residential segregation. Again, darker shading means more residential segregation in those particular counties. And why this matters is because, again, back to that study that Keith Payne did, is yes, they found the relationship between slaves in 1860 and modern day levels of implicit bias, but what they found that affected or mediated that relationship was these other variables. So in those same counties, what you also find today is higher levels of residential segregation, more disparity in poverty, so concentrated poverty amongst Blacks, and less likely that Blacks were able to achieve upward mobility, so that their incomes are much better, that they were able to not pull themselves, that they were able to have reduced poverty or move out of poverty, I should say. So that was really what was driving or affecting the relationship between slaves and implicit bias, is that all these remnants of structural racism also were still existing in those same states and counties. And so what we did is pull data. What we have in the Midwest is there's really a primary diagnostic center through the University of Kansas Medical Center, where a lot of families go to get their kids diagnosed, just because of access to diagnoses in this area. And we pulled data from the intake evaluation of parents who have gone in to get their children or young adults diagnosed at this diagnostic center. And it resulted in data from 152 Black Latino children. And we couldn't disaggregate Black or Latino because the older data, they didn't separately ask for if one was Hispanic or Latino separate from race. So we couldn't always pull that apart. So we aggregated Black and Latino families, and we had compared them to a sample of 184 white children. And this is just some descriptive information about the sample. I'm happy to go in this in more detail than the Q&A, but just for the sake of time, I'll skim through it a little bit. But this is based on parent report at the time of the intake and sort of getting prepared for the diagnostic event. So again, our first question is, do Black or Latino children differ from white children in their access to school and mental health services? So one, we did find that they did. Now, what you may notice is no one's getting a lot of school services. It's just a number of services parents were reporting they were getting. But again, they were coming in for a diagnosis. They may not have, they likely didn't have one already. So white families were saying they were getting about 2 school, their kids were getting about, 2 or maybe some more school services, and Black families were getting an average, 1 school service. So they weren't getting a lot, but we did see significant differences in white families saying they were getting, more school services than Black Latino families. The same with mental health. No one's getting a lot. White families on average were reporting they were getting access to 1 kind of mental health support or service. Black and Latino families really weren't getting anything at the time. Obviously there are a few families who were getting something, but most weren't getting anything at the time of the diagnostic intake. And so that's just reflected in if you combine school and mental health services. The second question is, how are these county level variables related to access to services? So one of the things I want to point out is just some correlations between the variables themselves. So in counties where there's less Black upward mobility, so getting out of poverty, what we tend to see in those counties is more pro-white implicit bias. So a bias to more favorable towards whites. You see the opposite when there's a pro-Black implicit bias. The other thing you notice is that there's a negative correlation between Black poverty and white poverty. So in counties where there's high levels of white poverty, you don't see high levels of Black poverty, but that's likely because of residential segregation. So the white poor people tend to be clustered together and they aren't living in places where there are Black poor people. The Black poor people are also clustered together and they don't tend to live in places where there are white poor people. So that's what these data are reflecting. And also there's a relationship between Black poverty and residential segregation. Black poor people are concentrated together in certain counties in the Kansas City metro area, which is not specific to the Kansas City metro area. This plays itself out in lots of places throughout the US, and we know this. So what did we find? Something interesting here. So actually what we found was in counties with higher levels of pro-white implicit bias, Black and Latino families were actually more likely to get access to school and mental health services. I'll talk about why this may be, but it's sort of the opposite of what we may expect to find. But what we also did find, which is more aligned with our expectations, was that in counties with higher levels of residential segregation, so Blacks being clustered in certain counties within the Kansas City metro areas, Black and Latino families, I should say, let me clarify there, they were less likely to get access to mental health services if they were clustered in counties with high levels of residential segregation. We didn't find any associations for Black poverty rates or upward mobility. So in summary, Black and Latino children were less likely than white children to receive school and mental health services, but higher county levels of pro-white implicit bias were actually positively associated with Black and Latino children being more likely to receive school and mental health services. So some of you may be familiar with the implicit association test, which is the online test people can take. So one of the things you should know about it is that anyone can go online to take it, but usually it's mostly college students who go online to take it, and they're usually taking it as part of introductory education or psychology courses. So some of this may be reflecting who has completed the IAT in those counties. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. The residential segregation data is actually a reflection of true residential segregation. And though that finding was more in line with our expectations, that counties with high levels of residential segregation, in those counties, that Black and Latino children were less likely to receive mental health services, which may help us understand the actual disparities we're seeing with Black and Latino children reporting that they were less likely to receive mental health services. Okay. So one more study, and this is really just to make a larger point, I'm going to go through it quickly around sort of these issues of disparity. We also have, through some colleagues at KU, have some data that's part of the National Survey on Health Reform, and it's a nationally representative survey. Some folks from UW may be involved, but I do believe the survey was launched after the passage of the Affordable Care Act to really understand its impact on people with disabilities. And we pulled data on individuals with autism who identified as as being LGBTQ, and compared them to autistic individuals who identified as cisgender to look at outcomes. Again, to understand these issues of multiple minoritizing identities and what it means for outcomes. So again, this is just some demographics of the sample. Obviously, these are autistic adults, so we're dealing with older individuals with this particular study. So the first research question just actually compares two groups. So being autistic and being LGBTQ versus being autistic and cisgender. And I only pulled a little bit, just one slide of the data. We found various differences in outcomes, but one of the things I wanted to sort of report out today, and this is self-reported data, was that the LGBT group reported more unmet healthcare needs in comparison to those who were autistic but cisgender. And so then we want to, again, because the question is, well, why are there disparities? Not just that disparities exist, but what's driving disparity. That's where we need to get to. So then we looked within this LGBTQ group to look at what's predicting the unmet healthcare needs they're reporting. So we looked at 4 variables: race, ethnicity. Now, unfortunately, this was really just, we didn't have a lot of racial diversity in the sample, but we ended up dichotomizing the variable between white and non-white, something I don't like to do within studies, but we had to do it given the numbers we had. We also looked at whether these individuals lived above or below the federal poverty threshold, so essentially, income level. We also looked at whether they lived in a rural or urban area, whether that was a predictor of unmet healthcare needs. And then finally, we looked at if the individuals lived in a state where the state healthcare law specifically prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So those were the 4 predictive variables we looked at in terms of what actually predicted unmet healthcare needs. And what we found was that the actual only predictor was the actual laws that were passed. So individuals in states with laws that specifically prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, individuals with ASD who are also identified as LGBTQ had fewer unmet healthcare needs in those states. So not income, not rural-urban divide, not race ethnicity, but really state practices and laws around these issues. Okay. So then the question is, well, what can we do about these? Because this seems like such big, complex issues. We're talking about societal issues, we're talking about discrimination and racism and implicit biases that we all hold. How can we really overcome some of these things? Or where can we start? And we have to start small, but we can start somewhere. So these are just my ideas. I love to hear your ideas as well when we chat in the Q&A. So one of the things, I think one of the first places to start is that we have to acknowledge that autistic people have intersectional identities. And so if they do, we have to understand what that means, both the strengths and challenges of those intersectional identities. Not everything is doom and gloom. There are strengths that can be leveraged and understand, but we have to acknowledge that families cannot separate out these identities. And so what does it mean for access, experiences, and outcomes? The other thing is we have to stop ignoring that race matters. That Black autistic individuals, that Latino autistic individuals, that Asian immigrant or autistic individuals are having different experiences of America. They're having different experiences in relationship to schooling and therapy and just a variety of interactions. And we need to understand what that means for them, right? And we need to think not just about race, but actual racism, right? Because what we often know is that the driver of disparity is not the color of one's skin, but the impact the color of one's skin has on how it is associated with discriminatory behavior, which leads to the next bullet point, actually understanding the impact of discrimination and stigma, right? Because there's stigma sometimes associated with being autistic. What does that mean for their outcomes? But I also think it's important that we don't pathologize racial minorities, that we don't always think in deficit and at-risk models, but we also understand the cultural assets, the strengths, the cultural capital that being a minority brings with it. Elizabeth Morgan and Alban Stammer published a great paper on the cultural capital of Black families with autism and how they were able to leverage some of the cultural capital to really navigate and advocate and access services for their kids. So we need both sides of the story here, right? We need to understand what it means to have this intersection identity, but what are the strengths? What are the positives associated with those? We also just need to do a better job of training more BIPOC and autistic researchers and autistic clinicians. We need to make sure these groups are represented in the process, that they're involved in helping us to generate solutions. And because this is complex, it's not just going to be about individual behavior change, right? We're going to need multi-level and system-level interventions to really impact some of this work. And we recently published a paper really sort of thinking about how, at least us within the research community, can get started with some of this, can really get going with some of these, with engaging more racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically diverse communities, and how we can engage in true sort of community-based participatory research and true community academic partnerships to make sure that the community that we're studying, the community that we want to be involved in our research, that they're helping to generate the actual research questions and that they're giving input from the onset, right? Because that's how we're best going to overcome or address some of these issues, is with early and ongoing community input from the stakeholder groups that we're really trying to study and understand. And we have to all approach this work, right, with a lot of cultural humility. And, I'm not autistic. So in my research with autistic individuals, I have to understand that I don't have their perspective. And so we have to approach this work with lots of cultural humility in what we do. But the other thing that is a reality, and that we know, is that public policy and social norms do matter. And I'm going to get on my soapbox just a little bit. So please allow me that space. But one of the things that was found with implicit bias research, just in general, is that in states that went ahead and legalized same-sex marriage before it was, before the Supreme Court approved and it was legalized at the federal level, in states that went ahead and legalized same-sex marriage, that you already begin to see trends downwards in those states in the amount of anti-gay implicit bias. And then we began to see that at a broader level once the Supreme Court vote happened. So I think we have to think about states like Florida and the bills that are being passed, or like Texas, where we can't provide gender-affirming care, and what that means for change and implicit attitudes, because we're being constantly exposed to stereotypes and stereotypic images. And when we put in laws that reinforce, or policies that perhaps inadvertently reinforce those stereotypic images, they can have real life outcomes. Because again, the data show that even our implicit, our automatic, our unconscious associations can have real world consequences. They are associated with actual discriminatory behavior. So we can't ignore that our public policy and our social norms and our laws do matter in how we change behavior, how we go about changing some of these larger societal attitudes. So I'm not a policy person. I'm never going to get into policy. It's not my wheelhouse. I can't be neutral about some of these things. So, but for those of you who are, I encourage you to think about some of this. Our laws and policies do matter. So really, my last slide, rather than some thank yous, and we can have a nice conversation. I think, again, the reality is that racial ethnic disparities persist. And we're beginning to see these play out also among mental and physical health conditions. So real world consequences. And we know from research on Black people in general that discrimination and racism is associated with sort of physical and mental health outcomes. So really the research in autism is mirroring what we see in larger research on racial minority populations. So these racial ethnic disparities persist, and we know this. They've been replicated. We've been seeing them over time. for multiple years across multiple studies. And so what we need to get to now is why, because the why helps us do something about it, right? And even if it is these more complex issues around structural racism or implicit bias, there are things we can do or think about to address some of these larger issues. But we need to start shifting our mindset to think about these things. And related to that, as I said, we need to stop ignoring the impact of race and ethnicity. It is having an impact on outcomes. So we need to start thinking about how it's affecting access, experiences, and outcomes, right? But it is important to remember that the racial ethnic disparities we see in autism reflect larger structural inequalities in societies. When we see studies that the number of slaves in 1860 is associated with current levels of implicit bias, that's telling, right? Because what also happened in those same states between 1860 and now, right? Lots of Jim Crow laws, lots of other policies and practices that maintain segregation and discrimination. And those continue to sort of have an impact in the present day. And the other thing is that there are solutions. And these solutions may take more than individual behavior change, but there are things we can do at the level of the individual, right? We can think about how to understand strengths, so capital, the assets of racial minority families. We can tell the other side of the story. So we can better leverage those things, better leverage those experiences in helping drive solutions. And we can better involve these groups in helping to generate solutions. One of the things I'm always struck by is that often stakeholder groups have figured out something. They've already figured out the solution to the problem. It's just that we're not listening to them, right? And so how do we really listen, do true listening to these communities to help them, help us solve some of these larger issues? All right, so thank you. And I just want to acknowledge some folks who are involved in this. So Keith Payne, who is a social psychologist at UNC Chapel Hill, really does a lot around implicit bias. One of my current postdocs, Anna Walla, she really helped with a lot of the slides and the data related to this presentation. And Jean Hall is a key researcher who leads that national, who's one of the researchers, not that she leads it all, but she's one of the researchers involved in that national health reform sort of survey that's being done to understand the impact of healthcare reform on people with disabilities. So thank you, and I will actually stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd, for this important, powerful, and really thought-provoking presentation. We have many wonderful questions from our attendees, so we can move into our Q&A now, and we'll do our best to get through as many of the questions as we can, given the time we have. Wonderful. So earlier on in your presentation, you spoke about measuring levels of implicit bias at the county and state level. And one of our attendees was curious about how that data was collected. So how those IAT data were collected at those levels.
Yeah, so really, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. So one of the things is that Harvard really maintains, I do believe it's maintained at Harvard, the Project Implicit database, essentially, and anyone can get access to these data. And it's really aggregated in different ways. And one of the ways you can get access to it is at the county level. So it's really a publicly available database that my colleague Keith Payne was using for the other study that we applied to the research questions within this project. So it's data that is accessible and has been used in other studies. And I do believe that it's, again, with that science study, it's not just US specific. I think you can get implicit bias data worldwide related to the IAT. And it's beyond race. They looked at other constructs, gender, disability, income. So there are various ways in which they've looked at implicit bias. We pull the implicit racial attitude data essentially from it.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you so much. Good to know that that data are really publicly available. Great. You mentioned that racism is structural because it is often legalized and reflected in our policies and laws. Would you provide us with an example of this in the US?
Yeah, I think we can think about some of the practices around redlining, around who could get access to bank loans that have historically happened, and how some of those things were codified into policies and laws within US society that really had a discriminatory impact, right? And so even in some places, those kinds of things still play themselves out in different ways. Even if we think about sort of residential zoning, which neighborhoods through which the railroad track may run, which neighborhood in which there may be more sort of environmental issues or challenges, or where they may put a power plant, and those kinds of things that really are reflected in passing of laws in terms of where those things can be located. And we don't always think about them in terms of racism, but there's a reason these things are happening. And I think it's important to name and name those things and not be afraid to talk about them. And so there we have history, both past but recent history of these things playing themselves out. But I think my larger point is that in autism, I think we have overlooked these issues is part of the issue, and that we should recognize that we see racial minority families, and racial minority families are grappling with larger societal issues that we should ignore, because it actually impacts sort of the availability and ability of a family to do things, right? And so it does have an impact.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So when you were talking about gender, I believe that you mentioned that cisgender autistic girls had better access. Would you speak to the role of race in that as well? So what are the data saying about access to care for BIPOC cisgender autistic girls and women?
Yeah, and the data weren't broken out by gender. So it was really that cisgender autistic individuals in general had sort of fewer unmet healthcare needs. And I think we also reported fewer issues around physical health and mental health in some of the larger findings. And I think, I have to bring up the slides again, what we saw in the cisgender group was really, I think, a general reflection of the breakdown that we see in autism in terms of male-female prevalence. What we saw in the LGBT group was a higher number of females and those who identified as other, so neither male or female, so non-binary. But I think that those kinds of questions that you're asking are the ones that need to be asked, is because what we saw in qualitative data that I didn't pull is some of those more intersectional issues. So Black and gay autistic individuals self-reported within a qualitative data even more issues. So one, not only finding a doctor who knew something about autism, but then finding a doctor where they felt comfortable disclosing that they were gay, but then maybe also finding a doctor who, if they didn't know, wasn't asking them the same kinds of questions or recommending the same kinds of treatments because of them being Black or being a racial minority. So when you think about all the ways in which we have these intersectional identities and how they could play themselves out, again, I know it makes cell sizes smaller, it makes answering questions more complex, and maybe we need to think about our methods, maybe we need to be thinking about more qualitative research to answer some of these questions. But I think what we're seeing is that these things are important because it's impacting people's experiences. So again, this was open-ended qualitative responses to these survey questions, but we did see racial minority gay autistic people bring up some of these issues, even though the questions weren't specifically about the impact of race on these things. So again, I hope whoever asked that question thinks about these, maybe wants to answer some of these questions, but I do think it's the next layer, the next layering of these kinds of research questions, because as I started off saying, no one, including myself, including any of us in this audience, can separate out our intersectional identities, right? And so we need to understand people's real complex lives and what all of these experiences mean for them.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We received several questions regarding tangible strategies to address service disparities and increase equity, so especially at the intersection of race and disability. What strategies would you recommend, or strategies do you use in your work?
Yeah, I think these are really, really good questions, and the ones we sort of have to get ourselves to, right? And I think part of it is I worry that we sometimes put too much onus on parents and families, but certainly strategies around family empowerment are really important. How can we help families better navigate some of these issues? I think one of the things is we need more culturally centered service navigation models, right? Because again, some studies are finding that families figure some things out really because they've had to navigate life around other issues. So they're using what's most culturally affirming and appropriate for them to engage with some of these service systems. So understanding what they're already doing and building upon and leveraging those strengths. There's a reality that our workforce isn't diverse enough. That's a reality. And so the lack of diversity in the workforce comes with some of these implicit biases in terms of what gets recommended, what treatment options are recommended, how we discuss autism, how we discuss treatment and services for families. And so part of it is we need to think about how we diversify the workforce. We also need to think about, and within ourselves, right, things that we can do to approach some of these issues, as I said, with cultural humility, and really think about our own biases and how we can overcome them, or how we can minimize the impact they may have when we interact with families who are culturally different from us in some way. So I think there are a number of things. There's some family things, there's some workforce development things that we can do that aren't about some of the larger societal things that may have to also come into play related to these issues. So I do think there are some tangible things that we can do to address some of these issues. And again, some of it has been public awareness there, right? I mean, in terms of the incidence and just the overall prevalence of autism flows in between Black and white families, part of that is likely just through better public health campaigns to help families and clinicians recognize early signs around Black families, and just bringing a spotlight and attention to this difference in the disparities we were seeing in diagnosis. So bringing attention to some of these issues is also something we can do, right? Spotlighting some of these issues is really important, and making sure they're staying at the forefront. You know, these conversations around race and racism came about because of larger societal movements, but the problem with movements is they can go away when the next movement comes along. So how do we keep these issues at the forefront, at the center of the work we do?
Excellent. Absolutely. I think this next question from one of our attendees really dovetails with what you're talking about regarding kind of spotlighting these issues. What methods or suggestions do you have for evaluating practices for bias and or upholding oppressive systems? So be that in schools, community clinics, private practice.
For understanding if there's bias at play in those contexts, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, part of it is our current measures are problematic in many ways, but I say usually the way we know if it's manifesting bias or these other issues of racism is likely in experience and outcomes, right? So are we seeing differences in the kinds of services that racial minority families are getting in those contexts? So one of the things we know in general, or we see in general, with Black kids within the special education system is that they're more likely to be put in segregated placement settings and inclusive placement settings, right, than their white peers. And so they're more likely to be put into what is called this sort of education to essentially prison pipeline model, right? Because we know those in special education, they're more likely to have mental health issues and more likely to drop out of school. And there's these whole cascading series of events. So are we seeing these sort of disparities in placement within school? Some of the things we also see that has been shown from some folks in LA County is that white families with autism were more likely to be accessing a disproportionate amount of the services, even though Latino children make up a way larger proportion of the actual children in those same counties. So why are we seeing those disparities? So are we just seeing disparities in experiences, right? So that lets us know that biases are playing themselves out. And then are we seeing disparities in outcomes? What are the outcomes? Looking at outcomes by racial ethnic groups, I think that helps us understand if there's disparity at play that we should think about and do something with. What are our data telling us to some degree?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And in thinking then about promoting inclusion and addressing disparities, what programs have worked well in schools to do this, promote inclusion and reduce structural racism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And others may know, I'm happy for others to chime in. I don't know of school-wide programs to some degree that to address these issues. But one of the things we just know about addressing implicit bias is that it's just exposure, spending time with people who are culturally different than you can help reduce implicit bias. So really, remember, implicit bias really is just stereotype formation to some degree, right? Because we're all constantly exposed to stereotypes through society. So actually being able to spend time with people of a different cultural group and realizing that people aren't just a stereotype is one helpful strategy that has been found to reduce implicit bias. So how do we do this purposeful cultural mixing or integration? So inclusion, right, can be a positive thing for how our attitudes change around people with disabilities, right? Spending time with someone who has a disability can change your perceptions and attitudes around what that means, right? We've actually seen that play out in actual research. It affects actual attitudes. It can affect people's ability in terms of thinking about the profession they may go into later in life. And the important thing is that some of these people may become, employers at one point, and they may decide to hire a person with a disability because of their early exposures and experiences. So, but one of the issues that we're seeing is that we are increasingly becoming a more segregated society. We tend to live in neighborhoods with people who look like us, who are from a similar income bracket as us, but this is associated with more stereotypes than with groups who are different than us, right? So all of us, including myself, need to spend more time with people who are different, right? It's a simple thing. I know it sounds simple, but we do know that it's one thing that has been important with changing, just at least the changing implicit biases. Dealing with larger issues of structural inequality, right, or more complicated issues that will take probably some more larger policy kinds of changes, but we can do policy level research and think about some of those things.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I'm curious for your thoughts on how policies might also help with what you're describing in terms of folks getting to spend time around others who are different from themselves, how those things might actually work together.
Yeah, I think we can think about some of these things. And I think people always think I'm not a public policy researcher, but we can study these things and understand. So for folks who do sort of infant mental health research, right, there's a recent study that just came out that's very, I think from the Baby First group, I do believe, looking at a poverty campaign. So how do we affect poverty? So giving families money early on has been a strategy, right? Providing actual, money to families who live in poverty. And did a randomized controlled trial where they provided families access, giving them money in a group where they did. And what they found was actual differences in the brain development of children. So families who got access to poverty, their kids had sort of, more developed brains. I'm not a brain researcher, so I'm probably not saying that well, but their brains did look different. And so there are policies that we can study, policy level things that we know can affect poverty, that we can do something about, because class is important here. Poverty level things that we can think about that may impact racial attitudes, right? That we can think about and address. And so it's really beginning thinking about some of these things in conjunction with individual behavior change kinds of things, is what I'm saying, is that you have to understand these things in conjunction with each other.
Thank you. Thinking a little bit about the practice side of things, how can providers better identify autism symptoms in minoritized children? So in particular with a focus on racial and ethnic minoritized groups.
That's a great question. So there's been some research that shows that, racial minority families, in particular Black families, are more likely to have their early developmental concerns about their children somewhat dismissed by their pediatricians and other providers early on. And part of that is it seems that Black families may notice different early signs. So not our typical early signs, where white families tend to point to issues around language development or maybe social communication symptoms, things that we more associate with autism. Black families may talk more about motor delays or challenging behavior, things that we see in autism but don't necessarily associate with autism. So knowing that that families may be bringing forth different developmental milestones early on is important to think about, but then following up on those to really probe families and understand where they're coming from with those things is really important. So I think there just has to be some recognition that families may be coming into understanding autism from different lenses and through different cultural lenses that may be impacting some of the early symptoms and concerns they're reporting to their providers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I know we are running up against the end of our time. So unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the wonderful questions from our attendees today, but thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. And I'll pass it along now. I see Dr. Bruns back on the screen here. But
share some slides again?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alana. You did such a fantastic job facilitating the Q&A, and we had so many wonderful questions. Dr. Boyd, it's been just a fantastic way to spend the first hour and 20 minutes of my Wednesday, and I hope others enjoyed it as well. Please complete the evaluation. You all also will have the opportunity to get certificates of attendance and Washington in-service forms after you complete the evaluation. And we will have the pleasure of getting to hang out with Dr. Boyd a little bit virtually at the Smart Center in a little bit here. But for everyone else who joined via the speaker series, thank you so much. And we will see you hopefully next month with Dr. Tish Jennings, who critical issue facing our educators in this day and age will be focusing on building resilience for our teachers and teacher wellness. Dr. Jennings is from the University of Virginia, and we hope you'll join us same time on Wednesday, April 27th. So thank you all again, and we will see you in future speaker series and other events soon.